The gaming landscape of the mid-2000s, which was when I was growing up, is probably the main reason that I developed an interest in unlicensed and bootleg games. My most prominent gaming memories were obviously with the major consoles that I grew up with, like the PS2 and Wii, but I also remember spending a lot of time with plug-and-play consoles. These things were super common when I was a kid, and for good reason. Not only was the form factor convenient and novel at the time, just plugging into the front of your TV with no additional setup, but they were also an easy way to get a bunch of games for really cheap. They were the officially licensed ones, sure, but the ones that stood out to me were the weird off-brand ones. You're telling me this N64 controller has 76,000 games on it? A lot of these were packed with stolen NES games, so they were a great value. But others had games that you weren't really going to find anywhere else. These were simple games made specifically to be put on plug-and-play sold at pharmacies and the like. Were they good? Of course not. But sometimes the absurdity of it all is what kept me coming back to them. One of my favorite games to point and laugh at when I was a kid was Challenge 100 on the Dream Gear 50-1. Alright, I know what you're thinking. You've been gone for a whole year, and you return to covering games by talking about this tiny plug-and-play game that you already talked about 7 years ago? Yeah. I know it's not very good, but I look back on the old video pretty fondly. It's the last video that I finished on my old laptop before it died, and I made it in one sitting on a day when I stayed home sick from middle school. Lounging back with a Gatorade in hand, Dream Gear hooked up to my DVD recorder that made everything look like it had been smeared with Vaseline. Good times. The video is pretty surface level like all of my old videos, but this really isn't a complicated game. So you might be questioning what the point of returning to this topic is, but just hear me out. Challenge 100 is a game created by JungleTak. I haven't really had much opportunity to talk about these guys up until now, but I suppose it's because they haven't really made anything of note. A lot of the companies that would go on to make plug-and-play games got their start in the Famicom bootleg scene, but as far as I can tell, that isn't the case for JungleTak. Since their inception, they've basically only made games for plug-and-play consoles, most of which ran on VT03 or VT09 hardware, which was essentially NES on a chip hardware with expanded graphical capabilities, along with some other under-the-hood changes. I'd elaborate further, but then I'd be repeating myself when I got around to talking about this thing, so I'll just leave it at that for now. It seems that JungleTak handled both hardware and software for plug-and-plays, serving as a white label producer of sorts. So a company like Dream Gear or Polaroid, for some reason, could just order a pre-made plug-and-play loaded with JungleTak software, and then they could have their logo slapped onto the controller and title screen. This was well before the age of My Arcade, so the stuff that Dream Gear sold was cheaper and far less custom than it is now. So that Dream Gear plug-and-play that I grew up with was just some generic JungleTak thing with another company's branding on it, I guess. Upon starting up Challenge 100, you're greeted with this. These guys here are clearly Keroppi, the Sanrio character, and I'd assume that this thing in the middle is either an artist's interpretation or some other character that they've reskinned to better match the in-game sprite. I love it when games do this. In my original video I mentioned that this title screen used to scare me as a kid, and I want to clear that up a little bit. No, I wasn't actually scared of this title screen as a kid. I was just bad at wording things when I was 12. What I really meant to say was that this title screen has a bit of an unsettling aura to it. It's not something that's exclusive to this game, but rather a common trait shared across a lot of these JungleTak games. This might be because a lot of these title screens didn't have any logos or copyright information because they removed them from their own games for some reason. They just feel so devoid of life. Now picture these on a giant 36-inch CRT TV, which was much larger than I was at the time, and that's pretty much how I experienced these as a kid. Alright, tangents over, let's start the game. This is a pretty basic infinite falling game. The screen constantly scrolls down, and you have to guide the character down as safely as possible. There's 5 types of platforms. The normal solid ground platforms, conveyor belts that constantly try to push you off, trampolines which will bounce you upwards, these platforms that collapse when you land on them which make you fall through, and spike platforms. You take damage whenever you land on a spike platform or touch the ceiling, but thankfully the presence of a health bar means that there's plenty of room for error. You earn health back by landing on one of the safe platforms, so you really shouldn't be running out of health unless you're sticking to the top for some reason. But if you do run out of health, it's game over. But the one thing that kept me coming back to this game as a kid was what happens when you fall to your death. It really didn't take much to amuse me as a kid, did it? I love everything about the presentation of this game. You've got this happy, upbeat music playing, and Keroppi looks pretty unbothered for being subjected to this eternal death trap. One wrong move, your fucking face is fried, bud. You as the player are tasked with prolonging his life, but at what cost? It never ends, so one of you is gonna have to give out eventually. This game's actually pretty well designed for plug-and-play standards. Sure, it's an extremely basic game, but it's pretty tightly designed. Since the platforms are randomly placed and the ceiling is rapidly approaching, you often have to react quickly and decide whether you should linger on the safe platforms until another one appears, or take a risk on one of the more hazardous platforms to descend. This seems pretty well thought out to me. It's not without its problems though. Once you're in freefall, you fall pretty fast and don't have much air control, so that makes it a little difficult to reach some platforms that look like you should be able to reach them just fine. The game also doesn't have any sort of difficulty increase. The scroll speed that you see at the start of the game is the scroll speed that you'll see at the end. You would think that it'd get faster the further down you go, as indicated by the layer counter here that's always counting up, but it's the same speed the whole way down. With that being the case though, I guess it shouldn't be hard to answer this question. Does the name Challenge 100 actually mean anything? The record being set at 99 seems to imply that the challenge would be to reach level 100, but does anything happen when you actually reach that? Well, I guess there's only one way to find out. And no. Nothing happens. I don't really know what I was expecting, but I guess it's good to know. Man, everything looks like it's scrolling now. And that's Challenge 100. It's nothing special, but it's a pretty good time waster for one of these plug-and-play games. Solid design, there wasn't really anything we could mess up on the control front, no collision issues, it just works. Nice work, JungleTech. Is what I would say if this game wasn't a direct clone of another game. Because of course it is. Would you really expect a company like JungleTech to make a good game on their own? Don't be ridiculous. See, these plug-and-play games started to come around in the early to mid-2000s, so while part of their competition was other plug-and-play consoles, an equally large competitor was the wealth of free-to-play PC games. This was an era where flash games ruled the internet, and shareware games were already very commonplace at this point, so while a good majority of the games on these plug-and-plays were just throwing garbage at the wall to see what stuck, sometimes the developers were a bit more resourceful and remade tried-and-true PC games instead. It saved them the work of designing a game on their own, and I'm sure they were encouraged to put as little time and effort into these things as possible. Some of these ports would actually be officially licensed by the people who made the original games, like with the Snood plug-and-play ports, but as soon as the license holder turned their head away for a second, they'd reskin them for use on their own products. In this particular case though, it's just good old-fashioned theft. Challenge 100 is a direct bootleg of a Japanese shareware game known as NS Shaft. As you can see, this is the exact same game. JungleTech were pretty shameless in what they lifted from this game. Aside from Karopi being the main character, Challenge 100 looks like a straight-up port of this game, even down to the background. I believe that this game was originally for Mac, and the Windows version seems to be missing the sound effects that the original version had. Unfortunately, even in the Mac version, you don't get to hear the sounds of the characters sizzling to death. That was a JungleTech original. The gameplay is obviously extremely similar, but seeing as this was a game that actually had to be designed as opposed to blatant plagiarism, there were some more considerations made to the gameplay here, and that makes it noticeably more enjoyable than Challenge 100. It seems that the random generation doesn't space things out nearly as much, so you don't have to make leaps of faith nearly as often as you do in Challenge 100, but the biggest advantage that this game has is that you move quite a bit faster, so the leaps of faith that you do have to do aren't nearly as risky. But yeah, aside from that, it's pretty much the same game. I have to give Challenge 100 some credit here though. Usually games that were made to fulfill a quota suffer from an obvious lack of giving a shit that makes them far worse from their inspiration, if not completely unplayable. But I wouldn't say that the plug-and-play version is significantly worse than the PC version, it's just not as good. I suppose that comes with the territory of being a simple game, but if some developers can fuck up Tetris, nothing is sacred. Of course, I couldn't just leave it at that. This isn't PirateGameThing, this is PirateGameThing. There are more layers to the Challenge 100 universe than I ever thought possible. So I have quite a bit of material to talk about here, and that comes in the form of different variants of the game, both from the future and from the past. But first, a little diversion. This is Towers. Look familiar? It would appear that this is another game built on top of the exact same engine, but instead of going down, you jump up. Oh, so like Doodle Jump or Frantic Mouse, right? Wrong. Seems that Karopi has somehow managed to get himself into yet another infinite death trap and, traumatized by the events of the last game, is now pacing back and forth in a panic. Whenever he reaches a wall, he turns around and heads in the other direction. You can't do anything to stop him. But what you can do is hold the A button to charge up this power meter, and when that's released, the character will jump. So the goal of this game is to get as high up as possible while having no control over the character's horizontal movement. But be careful, because if you scroll up the screen and then fall back down, you know, I'd probably be pacing back and forth in this situation too. This is a pretty interesting idea for a game. Every move requires a decent amount of thought and pretty much perfect timing in order to get the desired jump. You can't just turn around when you reach a gap, so you have to plan ahead to make sure that you won't fall to your death. If you're about to walk off a platform but are approaching a wall, you can save yourself by jumping to get some extra airtime. There's no hazards that'll outright damage you here like there are in Challenge 100, but between moving platforms and conveyor belts that are hellbent on making you fall, there's enough to make this game really challenging regardless. There's also these trampoline platforms which launch you really high if you charge up a jump on them. All good stuff. In theory. Here's the problem though. This sucks. You move way too slow and the platforms are so spaced out. These platforms should not be as far away from the walls as they are, because you don't get that much distance out of a jump. There are some instances where no matter what you do, you're just screwed. This engine also doesn't seem well equipped to handle moving platforms like this. You can't charge up a jump while that's happening. The charge meter also resets if you hold it down for too long. So I meant it when I said that you need perfect timing. I can't tell you how many jumps I missed because I released that button just slightly too late. And I'm not sure who they thought they were fooling when they put the high score of 99 on this game, because I haven't gotten anywhere remotely close to that. And I don't think that many people would have the patience for that either. So yeah, it's worse. I'd much rather play Challenge 100. Of course, I'm sure that you won't be surprised to hear that this game is also stolen. Towers is a direct clone of another shareware game by the same developers, known as NS Tower. God, this is so much better. Pretty much all of the advantages that NS Shaft had apply to this game as well. The character moves faster, which means that you get much more horizontal distance out of a jump. And the platforms also aren't nearly as spaced out. Falling is almost always avoidable, so if you die, it's probably your own fault. There's also more variety, with platforms that move up and down in addition to the ones that move side to side. In this case, there is no contest. Towers is a pretty bad clone of this game, and I wouldn't see myself playing the Jungle Tack version ever again. NS Tower is actually a decent amount of fun, but I still think I prefer NS Shaft and its derivatives. So I guess I'm in luck, because that's what the rest of these games are. First off, we're heading back to Challenge 100 one more time for... Thanks, I hate it. It's nice to see a more fleshed out title screen, but I guess they retroactively decided that Karopi isn't a frog. Now he's a crocodile, and they gave him a little friend here. The single player game is pretty much the same, but now there's no high score here. Guess that takes the Challenge 100 out of Challenge 100. But new to this version is a 2-player option. I'm gonna guess that this is just an alternating 2-player mode or something, because most of these plug-and-play games that I've seen are just one controller. Oh, I stand corrected, I guess. They actually got a simultaneous 2-player mode working, with this terrible crocodile sprite for the second player. Seriously, how did they put these two sprites together and think that that one was okay? The game hasn't changed much with 2 players, it just goes on until both players die this time. So now you get twice the sizzling action. It seems that this hardware wasn't really well equipped to handle something like this though, because it chugs when both players are in motion. Maybe it's poor optimization, maybe it's the emulator, I don't know. I haven't seen any of these Jungle Tack plug-and-plays with 2-player support like this, so I'd be interested to know where this version of the game came from. It's probably worth noting that NS Shaft had an identical 2-player mode, so this update here just brings it closer to feature parity. 2-player Shaft gameplay wasn't just some stroke of genius by Jungle Tack, unfortunately. As long as you can ignore the atrocities they've committed on the title screen, this is pretty much the same game in single-player mode though. Guess you shouldn't try to improve on what already works? Oh, thank God it's gone. This next one is an interesting one. This is 99 Layers. The Bootleg Games Wiki credits this game to Jungle Tack, but I'm not entirely sure if that's actually the case. This appeared on a console known as the Wicked Joystick, which ran on UM6578 hardware. This was another one of those enhanced NOACs created by UMC, which were actually one of the first companies making these single-chip clones. Jungle Tack did make games for this hardware before moving to VRT hardware, and some of the games on this plug-and-play are definitely based on Jungle Tack games, but I'm not sure if that's the case with 99 Layers here. This is, surprise surprise, another clone of NS Shaft, but this one is quite a bit more rudimentary in the visuals department. Despite that, it does seem to be the closest thing to a direct port of the game. You've got the spikes on the ceilings, arrows on the conveyor belts, and the main character still looks like he has to shit his pants. And honestly, I think this one plays even more accurately to the original. Playing the 3 so far side by side, NS Shaft and 99 Layers definitely feel the most similar to each other. The controls feel just as good, so I guess this is the game to play if you're looking for a Shaft-style game on NES type hardware for some reason. I wanted to talk about this game at first because I thought it was interesting that there exists an earlier version of Challenge 100 that seems to be completely different, but with all the conflicting information, I can't really tell who to credit on this one. I also couldn't find any word on when the system came out, so I can't even say for sure that this predates Challenge 100, but given that there are other modified Jungle Tack games on this system, I wouldn't be surprised if this was based on some early version of what eventually became Challenge 100, and if the original version of this game still has yet to be found. If Jungle Tech wasn't involved though, it's still interesting that there are multiple clones of this specific game designed for plug-and-plays at the very least. Alright, back to the stuff that I'm certain Jungle Tech made. This is down to 100. If you look real hard, you could even spot the Junglesoft logo, from that time that Jungle Tech was trying to pass themselves off as a legitimate developer. From here on out, every game that I'm going to talk about was developed for the VT369. I'm sure that it just sounds like I'm pulling letters out of my ass here, but bear with me for a second. This one's actually kind of interesting. VT369 is essentially the Rolls-Royce of NES derivative plug-and-play hardware. As competing products from the likes of Sun Plus started to get more advanced, it seems that VR Technologies just kept upgrading their chips to try to keep up. While VT03 mostly enhanced the color palette, VT369 allows for all kinds of crazy stuff like a higher resolution display mode and fully sampled audio. In theory, it sounds like a great idea. These developers can make games for hardware that they're already familiar with, but with a whole bunch of new features that can make them rise above the competition. But of course, this hardware was never put to any good use. Yeah, it seems that the improved hardware didn't really do much to encourage developers to improve their games. In fact, I'd argue that most of the 369 enhanced games I've seen are of lower quality than VT03 games, with many of them even being stolen licensed NES games. I'd love to talk about these things in more detail, but I'm already getting off topic as is, so I'll have to save them for another time. The important part here though is that Down to 100 is a VT369 enhanced version of Challenge 100. I think. They did it. They broke Challenge 100. I told you it was possible. The first problem here is that everything's just too big. I guess it comes with the territory of making the sprites more detailed, but it means that there's just less room for the player to move around on screen. It also means that there's a lot less platforms to land on. But that's not the biggest problem, no. The biggest problem comes in the form of one of the biggest changes they made to the game. It actually gets faster. Now hear me out. I know I commented on the previous games not getting any faster as a bit of a downside, but that's because I think those games would have actually benefited from being a little faster with their smaller sprites and all. Here, everything's so big that you don't have much time to react to what's going on. They also didn't seem to bother to make sure that the springs would still work correctly as the speed increased. Beyond a certain speed, the springs become death traps that make the player vibrate in place until they reach the ceiling. So what often served as a risk and reward type of platform that might occasionally bounce you into the ceiling in the original are now more of a risk to land on than the spike platforms, which are supposed to be one of the main hazards here. The game seems to get faster depending on which layer you've reached, which in theory would be fine. In the previous games, there was a bit of distance between each layer, so I could see this working well if they maintain that system and speed increase gradually as you traverse the layers. Do you see where I'm getting with this? In Down to 100, they made it so that the layer counter increases every time you land on a solid platform, or every time it thinks you landed on a solid platform. It seems that this game gets kinda confused about what platform you're landing on. At first I thought it was just the samples getting mixed up, but then I noticed that it also changes what happens when you land on the platforms. Usually springs will increase the layer counter and, annoyingly, they also won't replenish any of your health like they did in Challenge 100. But if the game gets confused and starts playing the wrong sound, they'll do both of these things. Which means that you can just keep bouncing on the same spring to pump up your score. Of course, because the layer counter and speed are tied together, you probably wouldn't want to do that. This game gets really hard, really fast because of how quickly the speed will increase. At first I thought that getting to level 100 wouldn't be much of a challenge with the way that the layers are counted, but I tried so many times, and let me tell you, it's a lot harder than it looks. I did it though. And of course, for your efforts, you get nothing. I've been lied to again. I'm getting tired of this. Just one more thing that I wanted to mention about this one. I find it weird how Jungle Tech still chooses to use their old NES music in their VT369 games. They have the option to use whatever they want, but they're the only 369 developers that I've seen so far that don't use sampled music. They must be proud of it. Now, before I move on, there's something else that I want to mention about Jungle Tech. Somehow, despite all odds, it seems that time and time again they've managed to secure the rights to develop licensed games for other brands. For example, they were the ones behind the aforementioned Snood conversion for plug-and-plays, and also this VT03 port of Frogger for handhelds and plug-and-play games. And if you thought they'd bring their A-game for these licensed games, you'd be sadly mistaken. But those are still within the realm of video games from washed-up companies, so the fact that they got the licenses to those games isn't all too surprising. What is surprising though, is that somehow they've managed to get their hands on larger entertainment properties licenses on multiple occasions, and for these next games, we have a company known as Lexibook to thank for that. This is a European company that seems to specialize in making overpriced garbage electronic toys for high-profile licenses, like these officially licensed Super Mario dollar store walkie-talkies that they sell for £40. But of course, as far as this channel is concerned, they're most notable for their video game products. These are handhelds and consoles with official licenses from real, legitimate entertainment brands, loaded with jungle tech games running on VT369 hardware. And if you thought that any of these big licenses would make any of the companies involved put slightly more effort into these consoles, you'd be wrong. Take for example, this Disney Princess's handheld that prominently displays this Cooking Mama bootleg in the product photo, despite the fact that there already exists a version of this game that features Minnie Mouse instead. That's the level of quality we're talking about here. And this next game is a perfect example of the types of games that you could expect to see on these licensed handhelds. This is the Anti-Gravity Machine, based on... wait, shit. I gotta be careful when talking about children's stuff on YouTube. I wouldn't want this video to get marked as being for kids. Let's just say that the property this is based on is called TJ Maxx. This seems to be a newer show that appeals to really young kids, and I don't have any younger siblings or anything, so forgive me for being completely unfamiliar about what I'm talking about here. But yeah, for this officially licensed handheld, what we have here is a reskinned version of Down to 100. The sprite artist was spot on here. There isn't really much interesting about the game itself though. Like I said, I know nothing about the source material, so I'm not entirely sure if the anti-gravity machine is something that actually exists in this universe, but I have a feeling that nothing like this ever happens in the show. It's pretty much the same as Down to 100 with all of the problems remaining. Still too fast, still gets confused, same sound effects, same music, all the same. I suppose that shovelware based upon a children's show isn't all too surprising though. I doubt that there are very strict licensing guidelines regarding these things. But what if I told you that, a long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away, there was a Star Wars variant of Down to 100. This is a product of that partnership between Lexibook and Disney that I alluded to earlier. In case you've been living under a rock for the past decade, back in 2012, Disney acquired Lucasfilm as a part of their never-ending mission to own everything. They proceeded to break in their newly acquired money-printing machine by licensing out the Star Wars property to the worst companies possible. And sure enough, just in time for The Force Awakens, Lexibook announced a lineup of Star Wars themed toys that sent straight for the landfill. While not displayed in the press release announcing this line of garbage, I'd have to assume that this is around the time that the Star Wars Rebels Compact Cyber Arcade handheld was put out to market. Featured among the roster of 150 games are 10 games based around the Star Wars Rebels animated series. Of course, knowing what we already know, it should come as no surprise that these are reskins of previous Jungle Tech games. And with that, I present to you Sabine's Mission. It's the same shit. Yeah, this is just Down to 100 again, same issues and all. But this time, you've got a horribly compressed JPEG of the Death Star's interior looping in the background. Again, I apologize for not being all too knowledgeable about the subject at hand here, but as far as I can tell, the Death Star wasn't a large focus of the show that this game is supposedly a tie-in for, so I'm not entirely sure what this character is doing here, but what I can tell you is that this has nothing to do with the events of the show. I think my 10 seconds worth of research here is more than anyone on the team behind this product did. This is by far the worst looking game of the bunch. Sure, the discount store game had some pretty bad sprite work, but these graphics somehow managed to be even more offensive than some of the SNES to NES down conversions I've seen in the past. So much for that souped up hardware that this is running on. And this is a licensed game for the 5th highest grossing entertainment franchise of all time. How did this happen? Did anyone who managed these licenses look at the products that their licensees were actually selling? Look, I know that this isn't the first instance of Star Wars shovelware being packed into gimmicky hardware meant for kids, but at least the Jack-specific plug-and-plays from the 2000s had games specifically made for this purpose, and, well, they were released in the 2000s. This was a time before every toddler was a walking zombie with an iPad. By the mid to late 2010s, cheaper free mobile games had already taken their hold on the youth. Some of you watching this video probably grew up with those types of games, which, isn't terrifying at all. Not only were those usually higher quality games, but chances are, you didn't even have to buy another piece of hardware to play them on. And if you did, affordable Amazon Fire tablets were already on the market, and they were certainly a better value than the overpriced e-waste Lexibook was putting out. Who was the target audience for this? How are they still making these? Sorry, I might have gotten a little heated there. Man, I'd love to have a more in-depth look at these licensed handhelds sometime, but I'd prefer if I could actually get my hands on a unit first for the full experience. These things were mostly sold in Europe though, so they definitely won't come cheap, and I'm sure as hell not paying eBay prices for these things. So I think that's all I have about to say about this subject for now, so I should probably wrap things up. That was quite the ride, wasn't it? I wouldn't have thought that the topic of Challenge 100 would net so much information. I also never thought that I would ever talk about this game again, but when I saw all these different variants and the way that things just evolved over time, I knew that I had to look more into it. I'm sure this dragged on for way too long, so I appreciate it if you've somehow stuck around to the end. Alright, I lied, that wasn't the end. Real quick, while looking through CubeTech's VT369 games, I ran across yet another NS Shaft clone. I know this isn't a Jungle Tech game, so it's kinda out of the scope of this video, but I mean, I'm already in this deep. One more game shouldn't hurt. This is Jumpman, also known as Fatso Jumper. That's fucked up. It seems that CubeTech wasn't quite satisfied with the status quo and wanted to add their own twist to the standard Shaft formula. Firstly, they made everything puny and made the scroll speed ungodly slow. Great improvement. They also made it so that landing on a safe platform doesn't replenish any health. Instead, there are these floating fruits and other various items you can collect. But be careful, don't touch the rockets or you're toast. This game also gives you the unique opportunity to stomp Superman to death. I appreciate that. It seems that they forgot to implement one of the main sources of challenge of the original game though. The ceiling doesn't hurt you, so you can just ride a platform to the very top of the screen to maximize the amount of reaction time you have. So not only is the game ungodly slow, but you barely have to play it. Yeah, this sucks. The vibes though? Immaculate.